the water fuel cell. In 1998, in a Grove City, Ohio restaurant, an inventor named Stanley Meyer took a sip of cranberry juice, grabbed his throat, and ran into the parking lot. His last words to his brother were simple and terrifying. "They poisoned me." Minutes later, he was dead. The official autopsy ruled it a cerebral aneurysm, but for those who knew what Meyer had built, the timing was not a coincidence. Meyer had just signed a deal with two Belgian investors to scale an invention that terrified the global elite: a car that ran on water. This wasn't a magic trick. Meyer wasn't burning water, he was splitting it. His device, the water fuel cell, used a process called resonance electrolysis. By hitting water molecules with a specific electrical pulse frequency, he claimed to fracture the bond between hydrogen and oxygen with minimal energy input. Mainstream science says this violates the laws of thermodynamics. You can't get more energy out than you put in. But Meyer's Dune buggy, filmed driving across the American Midwest, didn't care about the laws of physics. It only cared about water. It produced zero emissions, traveled 100 miles on a few gallons, and the exhaust was nothing but water vapor. The threat this posed was absolute. If Meyer was right, the value of every barrel of oil on Earth would drop to zero overnight. The geopolitical power structures of the Middle East and the West would collapse. Meyer knew he was a target. He claimed he was offered millions of dollars by Arab investors to sell the patent and bury it. He refused. He claimed NATO officials were monitoring his lab. He refused to be intimidated, and then he died in a parking lot. Within days of his death, his workshop was raided. The dune buggy was seized. His experimental equipment, specifically the pulse frequency generator that was the key to the whole system, disappeared. When independent engineers later tried to replicate his patents, they failed. Why? Because the patents were incomplete. Meyer was paranoid. He never wrote down the true frequency settings. He kept the shortcut in his head. Critics call him a fraud who died of natural causes. But if he was a fraud, why was he offered millions to stop? Why was his lab stripped? And why, to this day, are discussion forums about his specific frequency tuning attacked with denial of service attacks and flooded with disinformation? Stanley Meyer built a machine that turned the most abundant substance on Earth into infinite fuel. And for that crime, his invention wasn't just erased, it was executed. The EV1, General Motors. In 2003, in the scorching heat of the Arizona desert, a crime was committed in broad daylight. Behind a chain-link fence shielded from the public eye by armed guards, heavy machinery was systematically crushing the future. One by one, sleek futuristic vehicles were lined up and compacted into cubes of scrap metal. These weren't defective prototypes or failed experiments. They were the General Motors EV1s, the world's first mass-produced electric cars, and they were being executed by the very company that built them. To understand why this happened, you have to go back to 1996. The world was different. Gasoline was king. But in California, a new mandate forced automakers to produce zero-emission vehicles or face losing the market. GM's response was the EV1, a car that looked like a spaceship and drove like a dream. It wasn't a glorified golf cart, it was an engineering marvel. It had a range of nearly 100 miles, regenerative braking, and an aerodynamic drag coefficient so low that it is still one of the most efficient shapes ever put on the road. It didn't just work, it worked too well. The drivers who leased the EV1 fell in love with it. It was fast, silent, and required zero gasoline. Celebrities like Tom Hanks and Mel Gibson drove them. There were waiting lists of thousands of people begging to get one. But there was a catch, a shortcut in the contract, that would eventually seal the car's fate. GM refused to sell the EV1. They would only lease it. You could never own the title. By the early 2000s, the political pressure on the auto industry had relaxed. The oil lobby had successfully weakened the California mandate. And suddenly, GM decided the experiment was over. They didn't just stop making the EV1, they recalled every single one. This is where the story turns from corporate strategy to active suppression. The lessees begged to keep their cars. They offered to buy them for cash, well above the market value. They sent letters, they held protests. They even staged a funeral for the cars at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. GM refused every check. They refused every plea. They sent tow trucks to repossess the vehicles from the driveways of sobbing owners. Why? Why destroy a product that people are fighting to pay you for? The official line was parts availability and liability concerns, but the internal reality was much darker. The EV1 proved a dangerous truth. Electric cars require almost no maintenance. No oil changes, no transmission fluid, no mufflers, no spark plugs. The dealership model and the entire automotive aftermarket industry makes the vast majority of its profit on service, not sales. The EV1 threatened to bankrupt the service industry. Furthermore, the oil industry saw a functioning electric car not as a niche toy, but as an existential threat. If the EV1 succeeded, the demand for gasoline would begin its slow death spiral, so the decision was made to erase the evidence. The cars were trucked to the Arizona proving grounds and crushed. A few were donated to museums and universities, but only after their drivetrains were gutted and their controllers disabled, ensuring they could never run again. They were turned into statues. The destruction of the EV1 set the electric car revolution back by 20 years. When you look at a Tesla today, realize that it is standing on the grave of the EV1. We didn't have to wait until the 2010s for electric vehicles. We had the technology in 1996. It was fully functional, beloved by the public, and ready for mass adoption. But it was dragged into the desert and crushed because a car that doesn't break down is a car that doesn't make enough money for the people in charge. The Wardenclyffe Tower, Nikola Tesla. In 1901, on the cliffs of Shoreham, Long Island, a structure began to rise that looked like a mushroom made of steel and wood. It was 187 feet tall, topped with a massive copper dome weighing 55 tons. To the locals, it was a curiosity. To the investors, it was a radio transmitter, but to its creator, Nikola Tesla, it was the machine that was going to liberate humanity. This was the Wardenclyffe Tower, and its destruction is perhaps the single greatest crime in the history of science. Tesla had already given the world alternating current, AC, the system that powers our homes today. But AC was flawed. It required wires. It required a grid. It required a centralized authority to generate the power and a copper umbilical cord to deliver it to the customer. Tesla hated this. He viewed the Earth itself as a massive conductor, a spherical capacitor capable of holding a charge. His plan for Wardenclyffe wasn't just to send radio signals across the Atlantic. It was to pump massive amounts of electrical energy into the Earth's crust, creating a standing wave that could be tapped into anywhere on the planet. Imagine a world with no power lines, no outlets, no batteries. You would simply stick a metal rod into the ground, in the middle of the Sahara Desert or the Amazon jungle, and receive unlimited free electricity to power lights, machinery, or vehicles. Tesla had already proven the concept worked on a smaller scale at his Colorado Springs lab, where he lit light bulbs wirelessly through the ground miles away. Wardenclyffe was the global scale-up, but technology requires money, and Tesla's money came from J.P. Morgan, the most powerful banker in America. Morgan had invested $150,000, millions today, believing Tesla was building a radio system to compete with Marconi. In a fateful meeting, Tesla revealed the true purpose of the tower. He told Morgan that he intended to destroy the energy monopoly. He explained that soon, the entire world would have access to limitless energy without paying a cent to a utility company. Morgan's reaction was cold and immediate. He famously asked, "If anyone can draw on the power, where do we put the meter?" Morgan wasn't just a banker. He was heavily invested in copper mines, rubber plantations, and the emerging electrical utility infrastructure. Tesla's invention wouldn't just improve the world, it would bankrupt J.P. Morgan. The funding was pulled instantly. Morgan blacklisted Tesla on Wall Street, ensuring no other investor would touch him. The project stalled. In 1917, under the pretext of national security during WWI, the U.S. government dynamited the tower and sold the scrap metal to pay Tesla's debts. But the suppression didn't end with the demolition. When Tesla died penniless in a New York hotel room in 1943, the U.S. Office of Alien Property, an agency that usually seized assets of enemies during war, raided his room. They confiscated over 80 trunks of his research papers. This was illegal. Tesla was a U.S. citizen. Yet the FBI and military intelligence classified his work on wireless power and death rays as top secret. To this day, the complete files from the Wardenclyffe era have never been fully released. Why? Because the physics didn't change. The Earth is still a conductor. The resonance frequency still exists. The destruction of the Wardenclyffe Tower wasn't a failure of engineering. It was a success of capitalism. We are still paying monthly electric bills, burning coal, and fighting wars over oil, all because 100 years ago, a banker realized he couldn't put a price tag on a miracle. Tesla tried to give us the stars. They gave us a meter instead. The Centennial Bulb. In a fire station in Livermore, California, there hangs a light bulb that defies the laws of modern consumerism. It is a hand-blown carbon filament bulb manufactured by the Shelby Electric Company. It was turned on in 1901. Aside from a few power outages and moves, it has been burning continuously for over 120 years. This single object, glowing with a soft amber light, is the ultimate proof of a conspiracy that isn't a theory. It is a documented historical fact. The existence of the Centennial Bulb proves that by the early 20th century, we had the technology to build lighting that effectively lasts forever. The filaments were thicker, the vacuum seals were robust, and the engineering was designed for durability. So, why do the bulbs in your house burn out every year? Because a group of men in suits decided they had to. On December 23, 1924, the world's top light bulb manufacturers, including Philips, Osram, and General Electric, met secretly in Geneva, Switzerland. They formed the Phoebus cartel. Their problem was simple. Efficiency was bad for business. If you sell a bulb that lasts 100 years, you never sell another one to that customer. The market would saturate and profits would collapse. So, the cartel did something unprecedented. They instituted a global ban on quality. Documents uncovered decades later reveal a chilling level of coordination. The cartel set a strict standard. The lifespan of a light bulb must be lowered from the industry average of 2,500 hours to a maximum of 1,000 hours. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a law. The cartel employed a bureaucratic army to enforce it. Manufacturers had to send samples of their bulbs to central testing labs in Switzerland. If a factory produced a bulb that lasted too long, say 1,500 hours, they were fined. The engineers were ordered to reverse engineer their own products, deliberately making the filaments thinner and more fragile until they met the 1,000-hour failure target. This was the birth of planned obsolescence, the economic model that drives our entire world today. The Centennial Bulb is a survivor from the era before the timeline split. It represents the path not taken. The cartel officially dissolved in 1939 due to World War II, but the damage was done. The standard was set. To this day, the lighting industry, and now the smartphone and appliance industries, relies on the cycle of breaking and replacing. When you look at the Centennial Bulb on its live webcam, you aren't just looking at a quirky antique. You are looking at a prisoner. It is the last witness to a crime where the victim was human progress. We could have had a world of eternal machines, durable goods, and zero waste. Instead, we got the 1,000-hour cap, designed 100 years ago by a cartel that decided your light should always have an expiration date. The Eastern Air Cleaner. In the chaotic years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the industrial zones of Eastern Europe were some of the most polluted places on Earth. But in the early 1990s, in the outskirts of Krakow, Poland, a team of former military scientists unveiled a black box that promised to fix it all. They called it the Eastern Air Cleaner, but it wasn't a filter. Filters get clogged. Filters need replacing. This device used cold plasma. Developed in secret during the Cold War for biological defense, the technology created a localized electrostatic field that didn't just catch dust, it destroyed it. When air passed through the device, an electrical discharge turned oxygen molecules into highly reactive plasma. This plasma attacked pollutants, smoke, viruses, toxic chemicals like benzene, at the molecular level, breaking their atomic bonds and turning them into harmless vapor. In a demonstration for regional officials, the device cleared a smoke-filled warehouse in under an hour. In another test, it neutralized 98% of formaldehyde in a sealed chamber in 11 minutes. This was the holy grail of environmental engineering, a machine that creates sterile, mountain-quality air in the middle of a smog-choked city, with no moving parts and no filters to replace. And that was the problem. The business of air quality is a multi-billion-dollar industry built on consumables. HVAC systems, HEPA filters, and industrial scrubbers all require constant maintenance and replacement. A device that cleans the air permanently using only a trickle of electricity destroys that recurring revenue model. But the threat went deeper. The medical implications were staggering. If you can sterilize the air in homes and hospitals instantly, you decimate the market for allergy medications, asthma treatments, and airborne viral therapies. The crackdown was swift and silent. By 1994, the Krakow facility was raided. The official story cited customs violations and patent irregularities. The scientists were harassed. The lead engineer was detained at a border crossing, his laptop and schematics seized. Shipments of the prototype units vanished during transit to Western buyers. Then came the regulatory strangulation. The European export laws were suddenly updated to classify the specific plasma emitters used in the device as dual-use technology with military applications, effectively banning their sale to the public. The company dissolved. The team scattered. Today, ionic air purifiers exist, but they are weak, watered-down toys compared to the industrial-grade plasma reactor built in Poland. We are left buying paper filters and wearing masks, choking on particulate matter that a team in the 90s had already figured out how to vaporize. The Eastern air cleaner proves that in the modern economy, a cure is often treated like a crime. The vacuum energy engine, Troy Hertubise. In the frozen woods of North Bay, Ontario, lived a man who didn't fit the profile of a dangerous revolutionary. Troy Hertubise was a scrap metal tinkerer, famous in the 90s for building a bear-proof suit and testing it by letting a truck hit him. But in 2004, Troy stopped playing with armor and started playing with physics. And that is when the laughter stopped and the black SUVs arrived. Troy claimed to have built a device he called the Angel Light. It was a bizarre contraption made of magnets, high-end lenses, and components cannibalized from military surplus. Troy claimed it didn't just manipulate light. It manipulated the vacuum of space itself. He invited reporters from the Discovery Channel and French government officials to his garage for a demonstration. What they saw defied explanation. Troy pointed the device at a wall. On a receiving screen, the observers could clearly see through the drywall, identifying the suit and number of a playing card hidden behind bricks. It was a wall hack for real life. But then, he turned up the power. He aimed the beam at a functioning radio and a garage door opener. They died instantly. The device didn't just see, it projected a beam of energy that disrupted electrical fields. Troy claimed it could stop a car engine from a mile away. He claimed it tapped into a form of light that could pass through lead, steel, and bone without radiation. The MIT physicists who reviewed his schematics were baffled. They couldn't explain how it worked, but they couldn't deny that something was happening. Troy had essentially built a directed energy weapon in his shed using junk parts. Then came the shortcut to silence. Troy reported that he was visited by men in dark suits who didn't show badges. They asked about the power source. They asked about the frequency. When he refused to hand over the prototype, his life began to unravel. His lab was broken into. A fire broke out in his workshop under suspicious circumstances. He claimed his phone was tapped and his family threatened. Terrified, Troy did the only thing he could to survive. He dismantled the Angel Light. He went on camera and stated, "I have taken it apart. It is too dangerous for anyone to have." He retreated into obscurity, bankrupted and paranoid. But the story has a final, tragic chapter. In 2018, Troy Hertubise died on a highway in northern Ontario. His car collided head-on with a fuel tanker in broad daylight, on a straight stretch of road under perfect weather conditions. Police ruled it an accident. Conspiracy theorists call it a cleanup. Troy Hertubise wasn't a trained physicist, which made him dangerous. He didn't know what was impossible, so he built it anyway. The Angel Light proved that a single man in a garage could threaten the multi-billion-dollar stealth and surveillance industries. And the system responded exactly how you would expect. The machine is gone, and the inventor is dead. The infinite battery, Carl Kordesh. In the early 1970s, while the world was paralyzed by the oil crisis and gas lines stretched for miles, a quiet Austrian chemist named Carl Kordesh was driving around Ohio in a car that shouldn't have existed. It was a converted Austin A40, and it didn't run on gasoline. It ran on a technology that Kordesh had perfected, a technology that threatened to make the internal combustion engine obsolete overnight, the alkaline fuel cell hybrid. Kordesh wasn't a garage tinkerer. He was a titan of industry, the co-inventor of the actual alkaline battery, the Duracell Energizer tech we use today. But his work on disposable batteries was just the funding for his real passion, a power source that wouldn't die. His Austin A40 was the world's first practical fuel cell hybrid vehicle. Inside the trunk was a hydrogen-air fuel cell system of his own design. Under the hood were lead-acid batteries. The fuel cell acted as an onboard charger, constantly, refilling the batteries while the car drove. The result was staggering. Kordesh drove this car as his daily commuter for 3 years. It had a range of 180 miles, rivaling electric cars released 40 years later, and a fuel efficiency equivalent to 80 miles per gallon. He didn't just build a prototype. He built the solution to the energy crisis. He proved that you could bypass oil entirely using hydrogen and existing battery tech. So, why aren't we driving Kordesh hybrids today? Because Kordesh made the mistake of showing it to the industry. When he presented his findings to corporate executives and energy regulators, the response was silence. The auto industry was married to the piston engine. The battery industry, which Kordesh himself helped build, was built on the model of disposability. A system that lasted for years without replacement was a financial nightmare for them. Kordesh later developed a rechargeable alkaline battery, a cell that could be reused dozens of times, effectively cutting consumer waste by 90%. What happened? It was licensed to Rayovac in the 80s, sold for a brief moment, and then pulled from the shelves. The market decided that single-use disposables were more profitable. Kordesh's Austin A40 was eventually retired to a museum, not because it failed, but because it worked too well in a world designed to sell you fuel. He proved that the range anxiety of electric cars was a solved problem in 1970. We spent the next 50 years pretending the solution didn't exist, buying gas and throwing away batteries, exactly as the business model intended, the magnet drive motor, Howard Johnson. In the world of physics, there is one rule you are never allowed to break, the second law of thermodynamics. It states essentially that you cannot get something for nothing. Perpetual motion is impossible. But in 1979, an inventor named Howard Johnson walked into the U.S. Patent Office with a device that made the laws of physics look like mere suggestions. Johnson wasn't a wizard. He was a pragmatic engineer who had worked on atomic energy projects. He presented a motor that had no batteries, no fuel tank, and no electrical cord. It ran entirely on the invisible, permanent force of magnetism. The patent examiners laughed. They had a standing policy to reject any application that looked like a perpetual motion machine. They demanded a working prototype, convinced he would fail. Johnson placed his device on the desk. It was a complex arrangement of permanent magnets fixed to a rotor and a stator. He released the brake. The motor began to spin. It accelerated. It generated horsepower, and it didn't stop. The examiners were stunned. In 1979, the U.S. government officially issued the patent number 4131 for a permanent magnet motor. This document is the shortcut that skeptics cannot explain away. You can look it up today. It is a government-verified acknowledgement that Johnson had built a device that converted the potential energy of magnetic fields into kinetic energy without any external input. Johnson's secret was geometry. He realized that standard magnets always find an equilibrium, a locking point, where the north and south poles attract and the motion stops. Johnson designed a specific curved geometry for his magnets that created a magnetic gate. As the rotor spun, the magnetic forces were unbalanced. The magnets on the rotor were constantly being pushed away by the stator magnets, but before they could get stuck in an attraction point, the geometry forced them into the next field of repulsion. It was a magnetic waterfall, a system that was always falling but never hitting the ground. Johnson appeared on the cover of Science and Mechanics magazine in 1980. He predicted a revolution. He planned to build a 5-kilowatt generator that could power a home forever, for free. And then the silence fell. Johnson didn't die mysteriously like Stanley Meyer, but his invention suffered a soft erasure. He claimed that he was approached by corporate interests who offered him massive sums to buy the rights, not to develop it, but to shelf it. When he refused, he found himself buried in litigation. His lab was raided under obscure legal pretenses. Licensing deals that seemed solid suddenly evaporated. The scientific establishment, rather than investigating the breakthrough, simply ignored it, labeling it an anomaly that wasn't worth researching. Howard Johnson died in 2008, bitter and broke, but he left behind the one thing they couldn't erase. Patent 4/151/431. It remains on the books, a silent 131. It remains on. Testament to a forbidden technology. It proves that the energy crisis is a lie. We don't need to burn dead dinosaurs or split atoms to keep the lights on. The energy is already there, locked inside the spin of electrons in a magnet, waiting for someone brave enough to build the right geometry again. The trash fuel converter, Project Gaia. In 2003, in the industrial outskirts of São Paulo, Brazil, a group of engineers achieved the ultimate alchemy. They didn't turn lead into gold. They did something far more valuable. They turned garbage into gasoline. The project was codenamed Project Gaia. The machine looked unassuming, roughly the size of a shipping container, humming quietly in a warehouse. But what went inside was the nightmare of modern civilization: plastic bottles, medical waste, old tires, and styrofoam. What came out the other end was clear, high-grade liquid fuel. This wasn't simple incineration. Burning trash creates toxic smoke. The Brazilian team was using a process called thermal depolymerization, TDP. Think of it as geology in a box. In nature, it takes the Earth millions of years of heat and pressure to turn dead plants into crude oil. Project Gaia simply sped up the clock. By subjecting the waste to intense pressure and heat in a hydrous environment, they broke the long-chain polymers of the plastic, which is made from oil, back down into short-chain hydrocarbons. They effectively reversed the manufacturing process. The results were terrifyingly efficient. One demonstration showed the machine powering a massive diesel generator for 48 hours straight, running entirely on fuel distilled from the local landfill. The exhaust was cleaner than the air in downtown São Paulo. The implications were staggering. Brazil has massive landfills and a hunger for energy. This invention solved both problems at once. It meant that every dump was actually a gold mine. It meant that waste didn't exist, only unprocessed fuel. Then, the system reacted. Just weeks after the team began demonstrating the technology to local municipalities, the crackdown arrived. It didn't come in the form of a scientific review. It came as a raid. Authorities stormed the warehouse. They didn't give the team an award. They slapped them with environmental violations. The logic was a masterpiece of bureaucratic suppression. They claimed the machine was an unlicensed refinery. Because the fuel it produced was so pure, the government argued it fell under the strict monopoly of the state-run oil infrastructure. And since the team wasn't a registered oil company, they were breaking the law. The prototype was confiscated. The permits were revoked. The engineers, facing prison time and massive fines, scattered. Some reports say the lead developer fled to Uruguay to escape the legal harassment. The technology didn't disappear. Thermal depolymerization is real science. But its deployment for the public good was killed. Today we are told that plastic pollution is our fault. We are told to recycle, even though we know most of it ends up in the ocean. But 20 years ago, a machine in Brazil proved that we could eat our own waste and drive our cars on it. Project Gaia was a race not because it was dangerous to the environment, but because it was dangerous to the economy. If trash is free fuel, who would ever pay for gas again? The illness prediction scanner, the neuroscope. In 2009, in a sterile lab in Geneva, Switzerland, a team of biomedical engineers turned on a device that threatened to bankrupt the pharmaceutical industry. It wasn't a new pill. It was a box the size of a toaster called the neuroscope. We are told that disease is a silent killer, that cancer and dementia grow undetected until it's too late. But the neuroscope proved that the body screams before it gets sick. It just screams in a language doctors aren't trained to hear: frequency. Building on the suppressed work of Royal Rife from the 1930s, the Geneva team used modern machine learning to map the electromagnetic field of the human body. Every cell in your body vibrates. Healthy cells have a specific harmonic resonance. Sick cells, cancerous tumors, degenerating neurons, vibrate differently. The neuroscope didn't need to cut you open or take blood. It simply scanned your biofield. In clinical trials, the results were terrifyingly accurate. The device could detect the electromagnetic static of a tumor months before a physical lump appeared. It flagged the neural dissonance of Alzheimer's years before the first memory loss. It was the ultimate early warning system. This should have been the greatest medical breakthrough of the 21st century. Instead, it was a death sentence for the project. Why? Because modern medicine is not built on prevention. It is built on management. Think about the business model. A patient diagnosed late requires surgeries, chemotherapy, years of medication, and endless diagnostic imaging. That patient is worth millions to the hospital system. A patient diagnosed early who changes their lifestyle or gets a minor procedure before the disease spreads. That patient is a financial loss. The suppression pattern was classic. Just as the neuroscope was moving towards mass production, the irregularities began. The lab servers were seized by authorities citing data privacy concerns. The lead engineer, a Romanian national, was suddenly deported for visa violations that had been ignored for years. Funding from European grants was frozen overnight. The official narrative was that the device was unproven pseudoscience. Yet, behind closed doors, reports suggest that the patent rights were quietly purchased by a shell company linked to a major pharmaceutical conglomerate, and then buried in a vault. The neuroscope vanished. The team was silenced. Today we are stuck with reactive medicine. We wait until we are dying to ask for help. But for a brief moment in 2009, we had a machine that could see the ghost of a disease before it possessed you. It was destroyed not because it was fake, but because it threatened the most profitable industry on Earth, the business of being sick. The Cloudbuster, Wilhelm Reich. And finally, the only invention on this list that caused the United States government to literally burn books. In the 1950s, Dr. Wilhelm Reich was not a fringe lunatic. He was a student of Sigmund Freud and a respected psychoanalyst, but he claimed to have discovered a biological energy that permeated the atmosphere. He called it orgone. Reich believed that droughts and storms were caused by stagnant orgone energy in the sky, so he built a machine to fix it. He called it the Cloudbuster. It looked like a weapon, a bank of hollow metal tubes pointed at the sky, grounded into a source of running water via heavy cables. Reich claimed the device didn't shoot anything. Rather, it acted like a lightning rod for atmospheric energy, drawing the dead energy out of the clouds and grounding it into the water, allowing natural rain cycles to restart. It sounds like science fiction until he turned it on. In 1953, the blueberry farmers of Maine were facing a catastrophic drought. Their crops were dying. Desperate, they hired Reich. On the morning of July 6th, the sky was clear. Reich set up his Cloudbuster and aimed the tubes. By that evening, the wind shifted. By the next morning, a soaking rain began to fall. The crop was saved. The farmers testified that Reich had done the impossible. But the government didn't see a miracle. They saw a threat. The Food and Drug Administration, FDA, launched a crusade against Reich that remains unparalleled in American history. They didn't just fine him. They declared that orgone energy does not exist, and therefore his devices were fraudulent. In 1956, federal agents raided his laboratory, Organon. They smashed his Cloudbusters with axes. But then they went further. Under a federal court order, agents gathered 6 tons of Reich's journals, research papers, and books, including titles that had nothing to do with physics, and burned them in an incinerator. This wasn't the Middle Ages. This was 1956 New York. The U.S. government was burning scientific literature. Reich was thrown into a federal penitentiary, where he died of heart failure just days before his parole hearing. Why the extreme violence? Why burn the books? Because Reich had touched the third rail of control, the weather. If a private citizen can bring rain to a drought using a few metal pipes, the government loses its power over agriculture, over water rights, and over the economy itself. The Cloudbuster proved that the sky belongs to everyone. The government burned his life's work to ensure that the sky remained theirs. 11 inventions, 11 crime scenes. From the water-powered cars of Ohio to the rain-making pipes of Maine, the pattern is undeniable. We are told that technology moves forward in a straight line, but these cases prove that the line is cut whenever it threatens the people in charge. We could have had free energy. We could have had eternal machines. We could have had a world without pollution. Instead, we have what they allowed us to keep. But the blueprints are still out there, if you know where to look. I'm the Shortcut Detective. The investigation is just beginning. Subscribe and turn on the bell. You don't want to miss what we dig up next.